on the 0 Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. What exactly can Joe Biden do when he becomes president on January 20th if he has a mind to do it? Our next guest and his team have been working on that very question. David Dayen is executive editor of the American Prospect, excellent journalist himself. And in David Dayen's words, without signing a single new law, the next president can lower prescription drug prices, cancel. It's a very long list. I won't read the whole thing. He can do a lot of stuff, is the basic answer. So the day one agenda at the American Prospect addresses the things Biden can do. So first of all, David Dayen, welcome back to the program.
All right. Thanks for having me on. Thanks for your interest in this.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's vitally important. And I think we should probably preface it by saying there are two scenarios, right? There's scenario A, where Biden has the Senate and the House. In my view, unlikely, but you never know. Things happen. Scenario B, which is one that maybe even fits more closely with the day one agenda, is the Republicans hold on to the Senate by the skin of their teeth. Is that fair kind of ground rules for the conversation?
I actually think in both scenarios, you're going to have to do some of this stuff. I mean, I've seen Joe Manchin make the rounds this week and say that legislation is essentially off the table. I don't know why he's a legislator, but that's kind of what he said. And, he would, in a 50-50 Senate, have a lot of power, as would Kyrsten Sinema, as would, any member of the Democratic caucus. So, progress is going to be fits and starts at best legislatively, even in the best case scenario, which argues that in order to have a successful presidency and show that Democrats actually care about the well-being of voters in this country, you're going to have to use executive action.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think you guys have done a great job looking into this. I think, as you say, in the best case scenario, even before the pandemic, the need was urgent. You yourself, David Dayen, have your unsanitized newsletter about the pandemic that goes out every day. It's excellent. I strongly encourage people to get to the Prospect and sign up for it. So it's going to be worse, way worse by January 20th, as far as I can tell. So presidential action is going to be urgently needed. Before we dive into the content of the day one agenda, Dave, just briefly, what was the process behind coming up with it? How was it put together? That sort of thing.
Yeah, we kind of referred to this, but we actually undertook this project in the fall of 2019, before there was ever such a thing that anyone heard of as coronavirus or anything like that, and before we knew that Biden was going to be the president. We did this as an exercise to look during the campaign at what could be done with executive authority. And I really wish it got more attention during the campaign, because it's really the job description of a president. I mean, if you look at Article 2, the primary function of a president, other than its actions in foreign policy and geopolitical strategy, is really to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. That's a quote from the Constitution. And in other words, Congress makes the laws, and the president and the executive branch implement those laws. And over the last, 230 plus years, there are quite a lot of laws that have been passed and can be implemented by a president in ways that they're not necessarily being implemented right now. And so, during campaigns, we ask presidential candidates about their long list of legislative priorities and the things they want to pass and their plans for this and that. But we don't ask them, well, what are you going to do with the laws that are already on the books, which is your job. Like, your job as a president is to implement those laws. So that was kind of part of the exercise when we initially did it, and also to show to the public that there need not be this despair if there's divided government, that you can still make progress. And, we didn't know how prescient that was going to be. after the election. But obviously, there's newfound attention on this because it's the likely path to progress now.
And David Dayen, and I've been talking about this a lot with people. There is this, I think you make a fantastic point about not asking potential presidents how they would enforce the laws. And I also think that on the Democratic side of the aisle, there is a long-standing culture of, well, we can't do much unless we can bring a few Republicans with us or whatever. Whereas Republican presidents have been much more assertive about, I would argue, not only carrying out the laws, but exceeding, writing their own in the process. And it seems to me that a little bit more executive assertion on the part of the Democratic president might be a mighty fine thing right about now. So,
and that was absolutely, Richard, that was absolutely in mind when we put this project together, that we didn't want a new president to come in and say that their hands were tied, because we know we have this database, we have this list of stuff that you can do, and it does not require Mitch McConnell's sign off. And so that was extremely important to us. And if you want proof of this, you just look to the presidency of Donald Trump. Donald Trump passed like one important law in his entire 4 years in office. That was the Trump tax cuts. That was really the only major piece of legislation. And yet he transformed the country because he used his executive authority in all sorts of ways, in immigration and trade and foreign policy and many other areas. In fact, he, one of the biggest things that he did with executive action is he paid off farmers tens of billions of dollars using a program that was inaugurated by FDR during the New Deal, called the Commodity Credit Corporation. So what we wanted to do is sort of like look under the surface and say, what is out there that's available to presidents on the Democratic side, the same way that Donald Trump found these things and his administration found these things. And the whole idea is not to abuse executive power, but to just use it. Use executive power for good.
Right. And so what do you, I'm curious, Dave, before we go into the specifics, did you guys like sit around a virtual table and just like with stacks of papers and say, well, there's this law and there's that law and there's what did the process look like? Who was involved?
Right. I mean, not quite. I mean, what we thought was, here are a bunch of things. Some of us knew of stuff and some of us had inklings. So we sought out experts. I mean, there are people whose job it is to know these kinds of things in tax policy and in prescription drug policy and things like that. And there were sort of ideas floating around during the primaries, and we just sort of were able to collate those all together based on, some of the articles were written by journalists and they sought out, trusted sources and experts, and some of them we went to the experts themselves.
So let's talk about, and again, we're talking with David Dayen, who is executive editor of the American Prospect, about their day one agenda. Day one being a mild play on your last name. Is that
that was not intentional?
The Dayen agenda. Okay, I'm on to you, pal. So let's. What are some of the ones we should start with? What are some of the things President Biden can do on January 21st?
Well, I know that one thing that's I know very important to you is student debt and the crisis in student debt. What we were able to find out is that under the Higher Education Act, the Education Secretary has the ability at their discretion to cancel any publicly held piece of student debt through something called compromise and settlement authority. I mean, we kind of already saw this during the pandemic. Donald Trump, through executive order, paused payments on student loans. And it's just a hop, skip, and a jump to say, we're going to pause those payments forever, and use compromise and settlement authority to cancel, what could be well over $1.5 trillion of student debt, which, as we know, is a real lead weight on the economy. You have graduates who have an inability to make major purchases and participate in the economy in a big way. And so canceling student debt would be a huge stimulus and good for this economy, and would go to people who are economically vulnerable.
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense. I happen to know there are constitutional lawyers out there who would, push back and say Congress has, sole budgetary authorities. So at some point you'd have to go to Congress for permission, but it's certainly an important issue, and one that I'm glad to see.
I mean, one thing that I think is an interesting possible use of the Day One agenda is to act as a spur to get Congress to act. So we know that this is a major problem, and Congress has not done anything about it. And President Biden could, on January 21st, step up to the podium and say, look, student debt is a huge problem. I have called for debt cancellation. I believe we have the authority to do it. I'm going to do it within the next 6 months, unless you guys get your act together and come up with something.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think it probably applies to everything on the agenda, right? I mean, in one shape or form, there'll be a way to do it. Now, the next item on the list, David Dayen, is at least the list I'm looking at, is also extremely, well, the first three are. So the first one, they're all dear to my list, but lower prescription drug prices.
Right.
Let's talk about
as someone who's experienced in healthcare. So there are a couple ways through one thing through Section 1498 of the U.S. Code, sometimes nicknamed eminent domain for patents. And the other one being something under the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, known as march-in rights. And they both are pretty similar. What you can do is you can seize the patents that were granted by the government of prescription drug companies if you feel that the drugs aren't being distributed on, quote, reasonable terms, and that could mean affordability. And so you can seize those patents, and because it's like eminent domain, you give just compensation for those patents, and then redistribute them to generic manufacturers who promise to issue the drugs on reasonable, affordable terms. And so that would have a tremendous effect of lowering the cost of prescription drugs all across. And this effect of using that as leverage, we've seen as recently as 2001. If you remember the drug Cipro, which was a cure for the anthrax problem, which we thought was going to be a really big issue. Bayer, I believe, made Cipro, and they were planning on selling it to the government at pretty exorbitant rates. And Tommy Thompson, the Republican Secretary of Health and Human Services, said, we will take your patent if you try to do this to try to gouge the public on this needed life-saving drug. And Bayer backed down and said, we'll give it to you for $1 a piece. So there's a history here, and there's a precedent here, and it's worked to leverage the drug industry and create one of the only ways that you can actually lower the cost, in any fashion of prescription drugs.
Yeah, I think it's both those Bayh-Dole and eminent domain are extremely important. And I'm wondering too, David Dayen, whether there is a role for the Defense Production Act in here. As you know, 1950 law during Korean War allows the government to, under certain circumstances, direct industry, in effect, to put in sort of industrial production plans for things that are needed for the country's safety and well-being. Does that have a place in the pharma world at all, you think?
It could. The government has to pay for that manufacturing. And so you do need some congressional action to authorize the funding. But if you believe in supply and demand, you could get various manufacturers to create a lot of a drug that we need, for example, a vaccine for coronavirus, and thereby lowering the cost of that. Although, I mean, in the case of the vaccine, there shouldn't really be any cost. But if you look at any prescription drug, if you increase the supply, theoretically, the demand stays constant and the price goes down. So yeah, that's possible. Although the Defense Production Act is a little trickier. There's got to be some money in the kitty in order to authorize the manufacture.
Okay, David Dayen, executive editor. It didn't come out. Executive editor of the American Prospect. Another one that is very close to my heart, as you know. Break up the big banks. Let's talk about that. How can a President Biden break up the big banks?
Well, Dodd-Frank offers a number of ways in which bank size can be altered. One of the biggest is the living will process. So every bank every year has to write out what is known as a living will, which is like sort of a roadmap to how to unwind them safely if they get into trouble. And those living wills are assessed by the FDIC and also the Federal Reserve. And a Biden FDIC and Federal Reserve can say, this is inadequate. In fact, in the past, during the Obama administration, they did say that it was inadequate. They just didn't sanction in any way that inadequacy. But they could look at the living will and say, we don't believe that you'll be able to be wound down successfully unless you cut your, you downsize in some way. And that's written into the law that they can force divestitures and force some cuts to their overall size. So that's a way to break up the banks. Another way is through the Federal Reserve, supervisory authority, or even the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which is sort of the super regulator that monitors systemic risk. They could take steps to say that a certain bank or above a certain size, it needs to be downsized. There are really a lot of very powerful regulatory authorities that were put in place, not just in Dodd-Frank, but even before then, Federal Reserve Act and so on, that allow the regulators to really set a course. We've seen this in the Trump administration with a lot of deregulatory policies and actions, and you can go in just the other direction with the Biden administration. Actually, what we've seen in the recent naming of the agency review teams for the Treasury and Fed of the Biden transition. These are the teams that go in and look at what the authorities are and what you can do. It's like an all-star team. The Treasury and Fed ones, like really good people that I think would have these kind of ideas in mind.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to, David Dayen, that while, a lot of people are noting that Joe Biden may, doesn't have the most progressive record necessarily on banking, I've had the same reaction that some of these staffing choices were very good. Gary Gensler was very strong. He's got a prominent role. I hope that turns into something substantive. And Ted Kaufman, who is Biden's former chief of staff in the Senate, who followed him as senator from Delaware, whatever, strengths and weaknesses he may have otherwise, I thought was very strong during the whole Dodd-Frank debate period. So
Ted Kaufman authored the amendment to break up the banks.
That's right. I forgot that.
Kaufman. It was Sherrod Brown and Ted Kaufman. So obviously he understands that a swelled up financial sector is bad for the economy, bad for inequality, and he's going to put people in place, and apparently has. That share that viewpoint and realize that there actually, even though that Brown-Kaufman amendment didn't pass, there are some authorities within Dodd-Frank and other laws that enable the banks or the regulators to get a handle on runaway bank size.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And David Dayen, the next one, they're all going to be close to my heart. I'm going to stop saying that. Give everyone who wants a bank account, which means public banking, right? Which could mean probably postal banking. Is that correct?
Yeah, postal banking, at least in terms of a simple bank account, is something that can be done under the existing authority of the U.S. Postal Service. They already do money orders, and they do international wire transfers and things like that. And it wouldn't be that much different to expand that authority to give bank accounts. In fact, the American Postal Workers Union, in its latest contract with the U.S. Postal Service actually mandated in the contract that you have to do pilot programs for postal banking in 3 select cities. Now, the Postal Service actually hasn't done that, and certainly, they didn't do it under Megan Brennan, who was the previous Postmaster General, and I would suspect that Louis DeJoy has no interest in that as well. But new personnel at the U.S. Postal Service, which is going to be available to a Biden administration, could, give a firm handshake to Louis DeJoy, thank him for his service, send him on his way, put in a new Postmaster General who would be interested in pursuing this postal banking option, which they're required to do under the collective bargaining agreement with the American Postal Workers Union.
And if I recall correctly, I haven't written about it for a while, Dave, but first of all, I think we had some form of postal banking in this country until the early 20th century, maybe.
Yeah, from 1911 to 1967, actually, we had postal banking in the United States. At its height, 4 million people had a bank account with the Postal Service.
Well, for me, the early 20th century ended with Sergeant Pepper came out, so I was right. But and I think that Japan maybe has it, or Germany has it, or something. So it's not it's not a crazy
number of countries. A number of countries in the world have postal banking, and in fact, when it was here in the United States, it was most popular among new immigrants because it was kind of commonplace to have your bank account at the post office in other countries. So this certainly would be a great way to increase financial inclusion, help the quarter of American households who have little or no access to the financial system.
And David Dayen, this next agenda item I know is close to your heart as well as mine because you wrote a book about it, and that is counteracting the dominance of monopoly power. So, I mean, this is such a huge issue, right? Because so many sectors of the economy are dominated by monopolies, duopolies, and so on, and so many parts of the country, and cable, and so many other things. So, what can a President Biden do there?
Well, we have a suite of existing laws going back to 1890 in the Sherman Antitrust Act that are supposed to protect the American people against monopolies. Since the early 1980s, they really have not been enforced to any major degree. Merger policy and there hasn't been a major anti-monopoly case outside of the Google one that was just laid out over the last month. That was the first one in like 20 years. So there's a lot that you can do with the existing laws, Sherman Act, the Federal Trade Commission Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act, to make sure that smaller businesses have a fair chance at gaining market share and stopping anti-competitive behaviors where they pop up. There's really a whole host of them. But stopping exclusive dealing, stopping non-compete contracts, which affect workers that can't move from one business to another, and a host, and then just changing the structural presumptions around mergers so that it's harder to merge if you're a big company.
I'd throw in ending mandatory arbitration clauses for customers and workers and contractors. I assume you agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, there's some things you can do. There's some court rulings that might frustrate that. However, because the federal government is a major contractor, like there's pretty much every large business has contracts with the federal government. You can certainly write an executive order that says all federal contracts will go to companies that don't have mandatory arbitration clauses for their customers or their employees. Right. And that's the end of it. Like that, it's pretty much every major company that you're talking about. That's a thing called high road contracting. You can also write in higher minimum wages, end to independent contractor kind of setups and arrangements, and a host of other things that protect workers and workplaces, and force it through the contracting mechanism.
So, David Dayen, about anti-monopoly efforts, I'm going to ask you an unfair question, but hopefully a fun one, which is, if you were named anti-monopoly czar, taking office on January 20th, January 21st, what are the first 5 things you would take on?
I guess it would be what? Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, and I don't know, Netflix, maybe. No,
maybe Comcast for sentimental reasons.
More seriously, I mean, I think I mentioned some of them. The whole concept of exclusive dealing, where companies say that I have to be you can't work with any other company if you work with me, and I'm big enough so that it's going to end up that you're not going to work with any other company. Changing the presumptions around predatory pricing so that you don't have companies that can lowball their competitors, force them out of business, and then raise prices in the aftermath. Changing the merger guidelines, I think, is one of the big ones. Right now, the way that it works is that if there's no perceived consumer harm, and usually that just means prices, then a merger can't really be stopped. When there are so many other harms from monopolies, not just from prices, but innovations and worker rights and worker wages and a whole host democratic considerations and a whole host of other things that should be included in the determination of merger policy. So there's a few.
So, and again, we're talking with David Dayen, executive editor of the American Prospect, about their day one agenda. Okay, I mean, there are many, but I'll pick one because labor rights are so important to the future of our economy. Make it easier for 800,000 workers to join a union. What's that about?
Yeah, there are a host of possible labor actions that can be taken by the next president. There are rules around overtime laws that could be beefed up so that people get a fair wage if they're working more than 40 hours a week. There are National Labor Relations Board rulings that can be made around joint employers so that you can handle, hold accountable a large company for the actions of their franchises. And so on and so on. What we specifically talked about there was about home care workers, either healthcare workers or child care workers. And right now, there's a restriction on whether they can have automatic dues checkoff, which is a fancy way of saying that it's just an administrative action that allows anyone who's paid through Medicaid to join a union and do so very easily. And the next president could, with the stroke of a pen, just say, "Yes, I'm allowing that ease of collective bargaining and ease of joining a union, and I'll allow automatic dues checkoff." And so that would immediately take one of the fastest growing professions in the country, which is home care workers, and potentially open up 800,000. And maybe more now, even a year later, this is a very fast growing profession, open them up to the ability to join a union.
Okay. And I think that's great. Fantastic. And okay, we're not going to get through all of them, but so I'll ask you about this last one. Hold crooked CEOs accountable.
Well, sure. I mean, the Justice Department is in control of the, it's part of the executive branch, and you can certainly make personnel appointments at the Justice Department and also in the criminal division that take the enforcement of the laws seriously and take violations seriously and seek to hold individuals accountable rather than let them off and maybe fine their businesses in ways that really only the shareholders pay for rather than the companies. So central to all of this is the fact that you need personnel that is creative and aggressive and willing to use the laws as they're written to really make progress. And so, accountability, which is something that's been largely missing from the scene for the last, 20 years, if not more, is something that can be brought back by an aggressive prosecutor in the Justice Department.
And I think that's great. And I just want to point out to folks that a couple of the other, I lost my tab. So, no, there it is. Okay. We're very informal here on the Zero Hour. Some of the others allow the effective legalization of marijuana, mandate reductions of greenhouse gas emissions, protect farmers from price discrimination and unfair dealing, force divestment from fossil fuel products, close a slew of tax loopholes. So we are, we're looking at really a impressive agenda here. And I think people are going to want to read it. Where should they go to find it?
Well, we just bought this URL to make it easier. So you just go to day1agenda.org. That's all one word, day one, O-N-E, day1agenda.org. And that will go to our prospect page, where not only will you see a list of all the articles that we wrote for the issue last fall, but we're actually coming up with new issues, new articles on a host of other subjects that a president can do on day one. We actually looked through the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force document and looked at which of those policies that are mentioned in there could be done through executive action. And we actually found 277 of them through that document. So the list that we have is very partial, and the full list of the federal government is very powerful. The executive branch is very powerful. They've been given a lot of authority by Congress, and they have the ability to really create tangible change and improvements to the lives of millions and millions of Americans. And if Joe Biden believes that he wants to be a successful president, if the Democratic Party believes that they want to retain the trust and regain the trust of the American people, they'll pursue this.
Well, I think I've made it clear, David Dayen, that I strongly support this project, encourage people to read it and follow it. I also find it a bracing antidote to Democratic learned helplessness. So without any further ado, David Dayen, executive editor of the American Prospect, thanks to you and the whole team for putting this together, and thanks for coming on the program.
All right, thanks a lot.
And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.